The cobblestones hit my knees before I understood I was falling. I remember the sky tilting, grey London sky, pigeons scattering, the cry of a flower seller cut short by the sound of my own body meeting the ground. I remember the cold of the stone through my thin dress, the scrape of grit against my palms, and the strange, shameful thought that at least if I died here, my stepfather would never find me. Then, nothing. A black tide pulling me under, and I did not fight it. I woke to warmth, not the warmth of sunlight or fire alone, but the warmth of clean linen against my skin, a feather pillow beneath my head, and a room that smelled of beeswax and lavender. My eyes opened to a ceiling painted with pale blue clouds and gilt-edged cherubs. For one delirious moment, I thought I had died and this was heaven, and that heaven, apparently, had crown moulding. Then a woman's voice, brisk and low. "She's coming round. Fetch His Grace." His Grace. I tried to sit up and the room lurched sideways. A firm hand pressed my shoulder back down, not unkindly, but without negotiation. "Steady now, miss. You've had a nasty turn. You're safe." Safe. The word tasted foreign. I had not been safe in 7 months, not since my mother's death, not since Gerald Huxley had inherited control of everything she'd left behind, including me. A door opened. I heard boots on polished wood, unhurried, deliberate. The walk of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. I turned my head and saw him. He was tall, dark-haired, perhaps 30, with a face that might have been carved for a Roman coin, severe in its beauty, cold in its composure. He wore no coat, only shirt sleeves and a waistcoat of charcoal grey, as though he had been interrupted at something. His eyes found mine across the room, and he stopped walking. He looked at me the way a man looks at a ghost. "It is you," he said, not a question. My pulse, already thready, kicked hard against my ribs. "I beg your pardon. Do I know you?" He did not answer immediately. He crossed to the chair beside the bed, lowered himself into it with careful precision, and studied my face as though confirming something he already knew. His eyes were grey, the grey of winter rivers, of storm clouds stacked against the horizon, and they held something I could not read. Recognition, certainty, and beneath it, something older and more dangerous. "No," he said quietly, "you do not know me." "Then how—" "Rest, miss." He paused, waiting. "Lennox," I whispered, because I was too weak to lie. "Eleanor Lennox." Something shifted behind his eyes. A muscle tightened along his jaw. He rose from the chair without another word and left the room, pulling the door shut behind him with a care that felt heavier than a slam. I stared at the painted ceiling with its ridiculous angels and thought, I have made a terrible mistake. I simply did not yet know which one. His name I learned from the housekeeper, a grey-haired woman named Mrs. Harding, who brought broth and information in equal measure, was Sebastian Ashworth, the Duke of Ravenswood. This was Ashworth House, his London residence, one of the finest in Mayfair. I had collapsed not 20 yards from his front steps, and he had personally carried me inside. "Carried me?" I repeated, the broth trembling in my hands. "Himself, miss. Wouldn't let the footman touch you. Gathered you up like you weighed nothing at all, and brought you straight through the front door." Mrs. Harding's eyebrows lifted meaningfully. Through the front door, not the servants' entrance. In 30 years of service, I have never seen His Grace do anything of the sort. Make of that what you will. I could make nothing of it. I was a woman in a borrowed nightgown, with no possessions, no money, and no name worth claiming. My mother had been a gentleman's daughter, respectable, educated, beloved. My father had been a naval captain who died at Trafalgar, before I could remember his face. And Gerald Huxley was the man my mother had married in desperation, when the money ran out. The man who had smiled at her funeral and turned to me that same evening with paperwork already drawn. He wanted to sell me, not in any way so crude as the word implies. Gerald was cleverer than that. He had arranged a marriage. Lord Colburn, a man of 63 with gout, a temper, and 3 dead wives, had offered a settlement of £4,000 for a young bride who would not argue. Gerald had accepted before the ink dried. I had fled the night before the wedding, taken nothing but my mother's letters, left nothing behind worth taking. And now I was in a duke's house, and the duke had looked at me as though he'd seen me before, and I did not understand any of it. 3 days I stayed, and 3 days the duke avoided me. Not obviously, he was too controlled for that. But I felt his absence like a deliberate thing, a door held carefully shut. I ate meals alone in a guest chamber, finer than any room I had ever slept in. Mrs. Harding brought me a dress, simple muslin, well made, smelling faintly of cedar, and would not say where it came from. A physician visited, declared me malnourished and exhausted but recovering, and prescribed rest and red meat and an alarming quantity of calves' foot jelly. On the 4th morning, I decided I could not remain any longer. I could not repay the Duke's hospitality, could not explain my presence, could not justify occupying a room that likely cost more per night in candle wax than I had earned in a year of needlework for Gerald's household. I dressed, braided my hair with the care of a woman armoring herself, and descended the great staircase into the entrance hall. He was there, standing beside a marble-topped table, reading a letter, morning light falling across his face in a way that made the severe lines of it almost unbearably beautiful. He looked up when he heard my step, and for one unguarded second, half a heartbeat, no more, something raw and tender crossed his features before the mask came down with the precision of a closing gate. "Miss Lennox, you should be resting." "I should be leaving, Your Grace. I have imposed upon your kindness long enough." "You have imposed nothing. Where would you go?" The question was gentle, and its gentleness destroyed me more than cruelty would have, because the answer was nowhere. I had nowhere to go. No friend in London, no relation who would risk Gerald's fury. No money, no references, no position. I was 22 years old, and I had nothing except the straight line of my spine and the voice in my head that sounded like my mother saying, "Chin up, Eleanor, chin up." "That," I said, lifting my chin exactly as she had taught me, as though dignity were armor and posture were a sword, "is my concern, not yours." A ghost of something, was it admiration, flickered across his mouth. "Sit down, Miss Lennox." "I will not, please." The word landed strangely. Dukes do not say please. Not like that, not quietly, not as though the word cost them something. I sat. He took the chair across from me. The entrance hall was vast, light pouring through windows tall enough to frame a cathedral, and we were 2 small figures in it, separated by 10 feet of marble floor, and whatever it was, he would not tell me. "There is a matter I must discuss with you," he said. "It concerns your mother." My breath stopped. My mother? Catherine Lennox, formerly Catherine Graves. "You knew her?" "No, but my father did." He reached into his waistcoat and produced something. A a small object wrapped in cloth. He set it on the table between us and unfolded the fabric with careful hands. Inside lay a miniature portrait, no larger than my palm, painted on ivory in the delicate style of the last century. It was my mother's face, younger than I had ever known her, perhaps 18, luminous, laughing, with a strand of dark hair escaping its pins. And beside her, arm linked through hers, another young woman, fair-haired, blue-eyed, with an expression of fierce, radiant joy. The other woman, said the Duke, was my mother, the Duchess of Ravenswood. I stared at the portrait. The two women looked at each other with the unmistakable intimacy of the deepest friendship, the kind forged in girlhood and meant to outlast everything. They were at school together, he continued, his voice measured, careful, as though he were reading from a document rather than recounting something that had clearly haunted him. Inseparable, by all accounts. When my mother married the Duke, your mother was her only correspondent outside the family. They wrote to each other for years, hundreds of letters. I found them after my father's death, bundled in ribbon, hidden in a writing desk he never thought to search. I don't understand, I whispered. My mother never mentioned. No, she wouldn't have. My father forbade the correspondence. He considered your mother beneath my mother's station and ended the friendship by force. He intercepted letters, returned them unopened, dismissed the servants who attempted to carry them. He stopped. When he spoke again, his voice was very controlled, the control of a man describing a wound he has never allowed himself to properly feel. My mother never recovered from the isolation. She died when I was 7. The physicians called it a fever, but Mrs. Harding, who was her lady's maid before she was my housekeeper, says it was loneliness. That my father locked her away from everyone who loved her, and she simply stopped. The portrait blurred. I was crying, silently, helplessly, for two women who had loved each other and been destroyed by a man who believed his authority entitled him to destroy whatever he wished. I found your mother's letters 6 months ago, he said. I have been looking for her, or for anyone connected to her, ever since. When you told me your name, he broke off. His composure, that granite wall, showed its first crack. A tremor at the corner of his mouth, quickly suppressed. I cannot undo what my father did, but I can ensure his cruelty does not echo into the next generation. I would like to offer you the protection of this house, not as charity, as a debt owed. A debt, not kindness, obligation. It should have stung, but instead it steadied me. Debts I understood. Debts had terms. Debts could be repaid and resolved and closed like a ledger. For how long? I asked. For as long as you require it. I looked at the miniature, my mother's laughing face, the Duchess's hand on her arm, and I understood that this portrait was the reason he had carried me through the front door. Not because of who I was, because of who she had been to his mother. Very well, I said, but I will earn my place. I am not ornamental. That almost smile again, quick as a knife and gone just as fast. No, I rather suspect you are not. I became, by some unspoken arrangement, a companion to the household. Not a servant, not a guest. Something uncategorized that made the staff exchange glances, and the few visitors who called raise their eyebrows behind their teacups. I organized the library, which had fallen into magnificent chaos since the old Duke's death, Volumes shelved by color rather than subject, letters used as bookmarks and forgotten, an entire section of navigation charts filed under miscellaneous. I assisted Mrs. Harding with household accounts, which were meticulous in their structure, but had been deliberately mismanaged by a dishonest steward, now dismissed. And I watched the Duke. He was not what I had expected. The coldness I had first perceived was not indifference, but discipline. The careful, exhausting work of a man who had learned early that feeling things openly was a form of vulnerability, and vulnerability was what had killed his mother. He ran the estate with precision. He answered correspondence before breakfast. He spoke to his tenants by name and remembered their children's ages, their illnesses, their disputes over boundary lines. Remembered them not as a political exercise, but because he genuinely could not stop himself from caring, and had decided, if he must care, to at least be thorough about it. But he was alone, surrounded by people and utterly, profoundly alone. I noticed it first in the library. He had a habit of sitting there at night, not reading, just sitting in the leather chair by the dying fire with a glass of brandy untouched beside him, staring at the shelves as though the books might eventually speak to him, since no one else did. I came upon him like this one evening, when I had returned for a volume I'd forgotten, and he startled at the sound of the door. Not dramatically, but with the flinch of a man unaccustomed to anyone seeking his company after dark. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not mean to intrude." "You are not intruding." He gestured toward the shelves. "You have more claim to this room than I do. I have not opened a book in 6 months. You have reorganized 4,000 of them." 4,217, I corrected, before I could stop myself. He looked at me. For one moment the mask slipped entirely, and I saw something that looked like delight. Startled, unpracticed delight, as though he had forgotten the expression and was relearning it in real time. "Sit," he said, "if you like." I should not have. It was 9 o'clock. There was no chaperone. The door was open only by a few inches, a gesture toward propriety that fooled no one, least of all Mrs. Harding, whose footsteps I heard, paused meaningfully in the corridor before continuing past. I sat. We did not speak much that first evening. I read. He pretended to read. The fire crackled between us, and the silence was not empty but full of the questions neither of us asked, the glances that caught and held a moment too long, the growing, terrifying awareness that the distance between our two chairs was both perfectly respectable and entirely insufficient. It became our habit. Every evening after supper, I would go to the library, and he would already be there, or he would arrive minutes later with the careful casualness of a man pretending he had not been watching the clock. We discussed books. He favored naval histories, I favored poetry, and we argued about Wordsworth with a passion that made Mrs. Harding, passing the door, mutter about people who could not simply say what they meant. "Wordsworth is sentimental," he insisted one evening, leaning forward in his chair with more animation than I had seen in him yet. "He mistakes emotion for insight." "And you mistake restraint for intelligence," I replied. "A man who cannot be moved by a daffodil is not disciplined. He is merely frightened of joy." He went very still. The firelight caught the edge of his jaw, the line of his throat above his cravat, and I realized with a lurch that we had been leaning toward each other without knowing it, that the distance between our chairs had somehow halved, that I could see the darker ring around his grey irises, that my pulse was doing something entirely inappropriate. "You think I am frightened of joy?" he said quietly. "I think you are frightened of anything you cannot control." The words hung in the air like smoke. His eyes held mine, and I watched something move behind them. Not anger, not amusement, but a recognition so raw it made my hands go cold. We had fallen back into our positions, he in his chair, I at the desk, as though the charged silence of 2 nights prior had been a dream neither of us would acknowledge. The silence that followed my words was a living thing. "I watch everyone in my household," he said. "It is my responsibility. You do not watch Mrs. Harding the way you watch me." Another silence. The pen in my hand had gone still. I could hear the fire. I could hear the clock. I could hear the sound of him breathing, and it occurred to me with devastating clarity that I had memorized the rhythm of his breathing without ever deciding to. "No," he said very quietly. "I do not." I set down the pen. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my wrists, in my throat, behind my eyes. "Why?" He rose from his chair, crossed the room, stopped 3 feet from where I sat, close enough that I could smell sandalwood and smoke and the wool of his evening coat, close enough that the air between us felt thin, dangerous, insufficient. "Because Mrs. Harding," he said, "does not look like her. Her, his mother, the woman in the portrait." "And you?" I asked, and my voice was barely a whisper now. "Do you look like your father?" The question landed like a slap. I watched it hit, watched his jaw tighten, his nostrils flare, his hands clench at his sides. For a moment, I thought he would turn and leave. Instead, he stood his ground and answered. "Every day, every mirror, every time someone calls me Your Grace, and I hear his title in my mouth." His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, hoarse, scraped raw by a confession he had clearly never made before. "I look exactly like him, and I am terrified. I've been terrified every day of my adult life, that the resemblance is not only physical." The confession hung between us, raw and exposed and bleeding. I stood. I should not have. I should have remained seated, maintained the distance, observed the invisible lines that governed every interaction between an unmarried woman and a duke who owed her nothing but a debt to a ghost. But I stood, and I stepped closer, and I lifted my hand and placed it, lightly, barely, tremblingly, against the side of his face. He went absolutely still, every muscle in his body locked, like a man who believed that if he moved, the touch would vanish, and he could not bear for it to vanish. "You carried a stranger through your front door," I said. "You kept your mother's letters for 6 months and searched for the woman who wrote them. You sit in the dark because you miss someone who died when you were 7 years old." My thumb brushed his cheekbone, and I felt the muscle beneath it tremble. "You are nothing like him." His hand came up and covered mine. His fingers were warm and they were shaking, and his eyes, those winter river eyes, were bright with something I had never seen in a man's face before. Not desire, though desire was there beneath everything like a bass note. Something more frightened, more precious, more costly to feel. Then the library door swung wide, and Mrs. Harding's voice rang out with the particular sharpness of a woman who has been listening at the keyhole and decided things had gone far enough. "Your Grace, Lord Colburn's carriage has been seen on the square." The world crashed back. Sebastian. And when had he become Sebastian in my mind? When had the formal title fallen away like a glove pulled free? Dropped my hand, as though it burned him. His face reassembled itself into the ducal mask with terrifying speed. One heartbeat, he was the man trembling beneath my palm. The next, he was the Duke of Ravenswood. And the Duke of Ravenswood did not tremble. "Colburn," he said flatly. My blood turned to ice water. "He's found me. Go upstairs. Do not come down. Whatever you hear, stay in your room." Sebastian, his name in my mouth, stopped us both. He stared at me, and I stared back. And the thing between us, that new, trembling, unnamed thing, pulled taut like a wire about to snap. "Please," he said. That word, that unbearable word that dukes do not say. I went. I did not stay in my room. I crept to the top of the staircase in my stockinged feet and pressed myself against the balustrade. The marble was cold through my dress. Voices rose from the entrance hall below. Sebastian's, cold and formal as a legal document, and another, oilier, thick with false pleasantry that made my skin crawl, with a familiarity I would have given anything to forget. Gerald Huxley. Not Colburn himself. Gerald, which was worse. Colburn was merely vile. Gerald was strategic. "Your Grace, I do appreciate the audience. A delicate matter. My stepdaughter, you see. Young woman, dark hair, rather slight. She has run off in a fit of nerves, and you can imagine my concern for her welfare." "I cannot, in fact, imagine your concern, Mr. Huxley." Sebastian's voice could have frozen the Thames in August. "As I understand it, your concern extends primarily to the settlement you would forfeit if the lady in question fails to appear at the altar." A pause. I could feel Gerald recalibrating from where I crouched, the subtle gear shift of a man adjusting his mask, selecting a new angle of attack. "Your Grace has been misinformed. Eleanor is my ward, my legal responsibility. I have documentation confirming my guardianship, and the marriage contract with Lord Colburn is entirely proper. If she is here, and I have it on good authority that she is, I must insist on her return." "You must insist." Sebastian repeated the words as though tasting something spoiled. "Tell me, Mr. Huxley, when you speak of insisting to a duke in his own house, do you imagine the conversation ending in your favor? Because I assure you, it will not. I have the law on my side, Your Grace. You have a contract of sale dressed in the language of matrimony, and you have the arrogance to present it in my home." Sebastian's voice did not rise. It dropped. And the quieter it became, the more lethal it sounded, like the sound of a blade being drawn slowly from its sheath. "Miss Lennox is under my protection. She will remain so. If you, or Lord Colburn, or any agent of either of you approaches this house, her person, or her reputation, you will discover that the legal resources available to a duke of the realm rather significantly exceed those available to a man who has been embezzling from his dead wife's estate." The silence that followed was magnificent. "I beg your pardon?" Gerald's voice had lost every drop of its oil. It was naked now, thin, reedy, afraid. "You heard me precisely. The accounts your late wife maintained were meticulous, a habit her daughter inherited, as it happens, along with her aptitude for arithmetic and her rather low tolerance for dishonesty. Discrepancies have been noted, documented. Should you press your claim to Miss Lennox, those documents will reach the appropriate authorities by morning post. Do I make myself understood, or shall I speak more slowly?" I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from making a sound. He had known. The household accounts I had been correcting, the figures that didn't match, the phantom expenses, the payments to vendors who did not exist. He had seen me working through them night after night, had watched me frown and recalculate and cross-reference. and he had understood what I was uncovering without my saying a single word. He had used it, not as a bludgeon but as a shield, placed silently and deliberately between me and the man who had sold my future for £4,000. Gerald left. I heard the front door close with the particular carefulness of a man who dared not slam it. Heard the carriage wheels on the square grow faint, and then silence. I descended the stairs barefoot, each step cold against my soles. Sebastian stood where Gerald had stood, his back to me, one hand braced against the marble table, his head bowed. His shoulders rose and fell with the effort of controlled breathing, the breathing of a man who has just done something that cost him more than he expected. When he heard my step, he turned. "I told you to stay upstairs." I have never been particularly good at doing what I'm told. I believe you may have noticed. "No," he said, and for the first time I heard something crack beneath the composure, something exhausted and frightened and fierce. "No, you are not. You used my mother's accounts. I used the truth. Your mother kept records detailed enough to convict him 3 times over. You found them. I merely ensured he knew they existed. You threatened a man in your own entrance hall for a woman you have known 4 days. I would have threatened the king himself." The words left him before he could stop them. I watched him hear what he had said, watched the shock of his own honesty cross his face like a wave of pain, followed by something worse, the realization that he meant it completely. We stood there, 5 feet apart, in a hall built for 100 guests, and the distance felt like nothing, like a formality, like a beautiful, elaborate lie that neither of us believed anymore. "Eleanor," he said, my Christian name, spoken in his low, careful voice, and it landed exactly as it should, like a thunderclap, like a lock turning, like a door blown open in a storm that had been building since the moment I woke in his house and found him watching me as though I were the answer to a question he had been asking all his life. "I need you to understand something," he continued. "The debt I spoke of, my father's cruelty, my mother's friend, it was real. But it is not why I carried you through the front door." "Then why?" "Because when I saw you lying on the street, I thought—" He stopped, swallowed. His throat worked visibly. He started again. "I have spent my entire life trying not to become my father, trying to be careful and controlled and decent and cold, because coldness felt safer than the alternative. And I looked at you, a stranger, unconscious, helpless on the pavement, and every rational thought I have ever had vanished. And the only thing left was the most irrational conviction I have ever experienced. Not her. Whatever happens in this world, not her." I did not know why. I still do not entirely know why. But I know it has not stopped. It has not lessened. And I know that if you leave this house, I will— He could not finish. The Duke of Ravenswood, who could face down blackmailers and navigate Parliament, and carry the weight of an ancient name without flinching, could not finish a sentence. I crossed the distance, 5 feet, a lifetime. I took his face in both my hands, and I kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. There was nothing gentle left in either of us, only the accumulated pressure of days that had felt like years, of grief and danger, and the unbearable relief of being understood by another human being for the first time. His arms came around me like a man seizing a lifeline in black water, and he kissed me back with the desperate precision of someone who had spent his whole life being careful and could not be careful for one more second. When we broke apart, we were both trembling. "This is madness," he whispered against my mouth. "Yes, society will never accept it. A duke in a penniless ward with no connections, no fortune, no family name worth. I know. Gerald will fight. Colburn will fight. My own family will. Sebastian." I held his gaze. "I have survived 7 months under Gerald Huxley's roof. I have survived hunger and exhaustion and collapsing in a London street. I walked away from everything I knew with nothing but my mother's letters and the clothes on my back. And I am still standing. I am not afraid of gossip." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the mask was gone. Entirely, completely gone. And what lay beneath was not the cold, controlled Duke of Ravenswood, but a man. Lonely, grieving, terrified, brave, more tender than he had ever allowed himself to be, who was looking at me as though I were the answer to a question he had stopped believing anyone would ever ask. "Then stay," he said. "I will." The season was in full bloom, and the Duke of Ravenswood presented Miss Eleanor Lennox to society at the Beaumont Ball on a Tuesday evening in May. Lady Ashworth, Sebastian's aunt, a formidable woman with silver hair pinned like a crown and opinions delivered with the precision of artillery fire, had agreed to serve as my chaperone, though her motives were less charitable than tactical. "If Sebastian insists on ruining himself," she told me over morning chocolate, examining me through a lorgnette as though I were a horse she was considering at auction, "he might as well do it with some style. I will not have my nephew's name attached to a scandal that lacks spectacle." I wore a gown of deep blue silk, borrowed from a cousin of Lady Ashworth's, altered by a seamstress who charged more per hour than Gerald paid his cook per month. Mrs. Harding had dressed my hair. My mother's portrait miniature hung on a thin ribbon at my throat, and when Sebastian saw me descending the staircase, he stopped mid-sentence, mid-word actually, and simply stood at the bottom step and looked up at me as though the rest of the room had ceased to exist. "Miss Lennox," he said, offering his arm with impeccable formality, while his eyes said everything that formality existed specifically to prevent. "Your Grace," I replied, placing my hand on his sleeve while my fingers pressed just slightly harder than propriety allowed. The Beaumont Ballroom was a cathedral of candlelight and judgment. 300 candles in crystal chandeliers, music from an orchestra partially hidden behind a screen of hothouse roses, and every single pair of eyes turning toward the entrance as the Duke of Ravenswood walked in with an unknown woman on his arm. I felt the assessments like physical weight, the cataloguing of my gown, my posture, my complexion, my origins, the precise mathematical calculation of my social inadequacy. A nobody, a nothing, on the arm of the most eligible man in England. Sebastian walked through it as though the room contained no one but the two of us. He did not acknowledge the whispers. He did not quicken his pace. He did not adjust his expression or loosen his hold on my hand. He simply walked, and his calm was a declaration louder than any announcement. But Gerald had friends. I saw Lady Whitmore first, a sharp-faced woman in emerald silk who had dined at Gerald's table so often she might as well have kept rooms there. She cut through the crowd with the smooth efficiency of a shark and arrived before us wearing a smile like a paper cut. "Your Grace, how absolutely delightful. And this must be the mysterious Miss Lennox. We have heard such fascinating stories." She turned to me with wide, innocent, predatory eyes. Tell me, my dear, is it true you were found unconscious in the street? How terribly dramatic. One does wonder what circumstances could drive a respectable young woman to such a state. The implication was clear and expertly aimed. A woman found collapsed in the gutter was either a prostitute, a drunkard, or mad, and none of these was suitable company for a duke. I felt Sebastian tense beside me, felt the thunderstorm gathering in his arm beneath my fingers, the shift in his posture that meant he was about to say something that would end Lady Whitmore's social standing for the next decade. And I squeezed his arm, lightly, just once, and answered myself. The circumstances, Lady Whitmore, were exhaustion and hunger. My stepfather's household was not generous in either meals or kindness. But I am certain you already knew that, given how frequently you dined at his table. I smiled. It was my mother's smile, the one she used when she was about to be devastating. The pheasant, I recall, was excellent. I helped pluck it. Silence. Absolute, crystalline, devastating silence. Lady Whitmore's smile curdled. Behind me, Lady Ashworth made a sound that might have been a cough and was unmistakably a laugh. Two women nearby exchanged glances of startled, delighted respect. Sebastian said nothing, but when I glanced up, the corner of his mouth, that severe, aristocratic mouth, was doing something it very rarely did. It was smiling, openly, unreservedly, as though he could not help it and had stopped trying. Gerald did not retreat. Gerald never retreated. He merely changed tactics. 2 weeks after the ball, a letter appeared in a gossip sheet. Unsigned, but composed with his particular brand of elegant cruelty. It named me a fortune huntress, a manipulator who had targeted the Duke's well-known grief over his late mother and exploited it with calculated precision. It hinted at improper conduct. It questioned my virtue, my parentage, my motives. It suggested that any man who had taken a woman found unconscious in the street was either a fool or complicit in something far worse. It was poison, carefully distilled, widely distributed, and impossible to wash off. Sebastian found me in the library with the sheet crumpled in my lap. Not crying, because I had sworn I would never cry over Gerald Huxley again, but sitting very still, the way you do when you are holding yourself together by force of will, and the force is running out. He took the paper from my hands, read it. His face did not change, but his hands, those careful, controlled hands that I had felt tremble against my cheek, crushed the sheet into a ball so tight his knuckles went white. "I will end this," he said. "You cannot fight a rumor with a title, Sebastian. The more you deny it, the more credible it becomes. I have no intention of fighting it with a title." He looked at me, and his expression was the most dangerous I had ever seen. Not angry, not cold, but certain. Absolutely, terrifyingly, beautifully certain. "I intend to fight it with the truth." The next morning, he called upon the editor of the gossip sheet directly. What transpired in that meeting I learned in pieces from Mrs. Harding, who maintained an intelligence network that would have been the envy of the War Office. His Grace had arrived with his solicitor. 3 sworn affidavits concerning Gerald Huxley's embezzlement from my mother's estate. A detailed accounting of Lord Colburn's 3 previous marriages, compiled by a Bow Street runner, whom Sebastian had apparently hired the very day after Gerald's visit. And, most devastatingly, a letter from Lady Ashworth offering her personal testimony regarding the Lennox family's respectability. Written in prose so withering that the editor was said to have gone pale reading it. The gossip sheet printed a retraction. Gerald Huxley was named publicly as a man under investigation for financial impropriety. Lord Colburn, faced with the sudden public interest in his matrimonial history, withdrew from London society entirely, and was rumoured to have left for the continent. And the Duke of Ravenswood, in a move that sent the Tun into such paroxysms of delighted scandal that 3 separate hostesses rearranged their guest lists overnight, placed a formal announcement in the Times. He proposed in the library. Of course he did. Not at a ball, not in a garden, not with any audience or orchestration or performance. In the library, at night, with the fire burned low to embers and the miniature portrait lying open on the desk between us. 2 young women painted decades ago, whose friendship had been destroyed by a man who believed love was a weakness and authority was a weapon, and whose children had found each other, despite everything he had done to prevent it. "I am not proposing because of the debt," Sebastian said. He was standing by the fire, and his voice was not steady. The Duke of Ravenswood, whose composure could survive parliamentary debates, public confrontations, and the combined scrutiny of every drawing room in London, could not keep his voice from shaking. "I am not proposing because of the announcement, or propriety, or because society expects it. I am proposing because you corrected my household accounts without being asked, and argued with me about Wordsworth, as though I were not a duke but a man, and fell asleep in my library with ink on your fingers and a volume of Keats open on your chest. And I have not drawn a single full breath since the night you touched my face and told me I was not my father." I stood from the desk. My hands were trembling, and I did not hide it. I was done hiding. "You are not your father," I said. "No," he said, and the word cracked in the middle like ice breaking in spring. And I saw what it cost him, what it had always cost him, to believe it. "No, I am not. And I am not my mother. I will not be locked away. I will not be silenced, or isolated, or made small to fit inside someone else's idea of what a wife should be. I will keep my own accounts and read my own books and argue about Wordsworth whenever I see fit. I would expect nothing less. I am not finished." I stepped closer. "I will also love you without restraint, without apology, and without any intention of being sensible about it. Because I have spent my entire life being sensible, and it nearly killed me, and I would very much prefer to be alive." He crossed the room in 2 strides and caught me against him, and the kiss was nothing like the first one. Not desperate, not frantic, but slow, deep, and certain. The kiss of a man who had finally stopped being afraid of joy. The kiss of a woman who had found the place where she could set down the weight she had been carrying since her mother closed her eyes for the last time. The portrait miniature lay open on the desk, catching the last ember light. 2 women, arm in arm, laughing at something lost to time. They had been separated by cruelty, by convention, by a man who believed he had the right to control what he could not understand. Their children stood in the same room, holding each other, and the debt, that old, impossible, unpayable debt, was finally, quietly, and irrevocably settled. We married in June, at the chapel on the grounds of Ravenswood Park in Kent, with bluebells threaded through my hair, and Lady Ashworth weeping into a handkerchief she would later deny ever owning. The ton talked. Of course they talked. A duke marrying a penniless nobody was fuel enough to power dinner conversation for an entire season. But talk, like fire, requires oxygen, and we gave it none. We retired to the country. We opened rooms that had been shut since the old duke's death. We received tenants who had been neglected for a generation. I catalogued the entire library properly, all 4,217 volumes, and found, tucked inside a book of poetry on a shelf too high for anyone but a woman willing to stand on a chair, One final letter. My mother's handwriting. Addressed to the Duchess. Never sent. 3 lines only. My dearest Charlotte, I miss you every day. I hope you know that nothing he did could change what we were to each other. You are loved. You were always loved. I brought it to Sebastian in the garden, where he was attempting, badly, and with the grim determination of a man accustomed to succeeding at everything, to prune a rosebush that had been neglected for 20 years. He read it standing in the sunlight with dirt on his hands and his cravat loosened and his sleeves rolled to the elbow. And when he looked up, his eyes were bright. She knew, he said. She knew. He tucked the letter into his waistcoat, beside the miniature portrait he carried every day. Had carried every day since the morning he showed it to me across a marble table in a hall that no longer felt vast, because we had filled it. Then he pulled me close, heedless of the gardener watching from the far end of the path, heedless of the dirt now smearing across the sleeve of my morning dress, heedless of everything but the sun on our faces and the smell of turned earth and roses and the quiet, persistent, astonishing miracle of being alive and together and free. The rosebush, I should note, survived his pruning. Barely. By autumn, it bloomed.